Okay, so I want to go into the aspects of a story so you can begin to get, you're not going to be able to get this in your first draft story. That's fine. But with very little practice, you can do this. So I'm now entering into the second section for those of you who are looking at the agenda, which is in the chat. And if you don't have it in the chat, Milree will add it in case you came in after he added it before. So there are three parts of the story you will not be surprised to hear. They are the beginning, the middle, and the end. And I want to go into what those are in a little more depth so that you can begin to use these as tools and not just see it as some academic exercise. So the first thing you do in a story is set the scene. So I have the words situation, circumstance, context there. Those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. What happens when a story begins with this? The princess came running down from her tower. What do you know? You don't have any way of focusing on what you know because you're asking yourself questions. What princess? What tower? What steps? What's going on here? That's why you want to give a background to begin with. So in another work story, you could say, I booked the first flight I could to Topeka. Okay, you booked a flight. Why are you going to Topeka? What's going on? What's the context here? When Alfred Hitchcock was telling his story, he deliberately left out the context because his story was nothing but a big joke, which is fine if that's what you're doing. It's not what you're doing in the workplace, but it was fine for what he did. And he knew exactly what he was doing by leaving that out. What we want to do is keep our listeners focused on what we want them to learn about us. So if we don't include a context, if we don't set the scene, then our listener will be distracted from the information that we're trying to give them. So then instead, we say the princess was sitting in her room in the turret at her spinning wheel, pining for a prince. Okay, that sounds like something's going on. We still haven't gotten what caused her to run down the stairs, but we have a sense of who the princess is. In the other story, Sylvia was a longtime controller at General Amalgamated. Presumably it's Sylvia's story. Then we have what started it all, an objective, an assignment, a trigger. In the princess's case, it was the woodcutter's son came into the castle courtyard. There was no story before the woodcutter's son came into the castle's courtyard. All the princess sitting at her wheel spinning was just background in the beginning of the story. The beginning ends at the trigger. Alice, my boss, came into my office and said, we have to close the year-end books 3 days early. I panicked. So what are the kinds of things, think about your own stories, or maybe in an example you make up, what are the kinds of things that typically start a story in motion, start you doing something at work? These are very basic things. One is your boss gives you an assignment, right? What else? Something not pretty basic also.
Maybe you were having a problem with a colleague in the office.
Yeah, so that then you decide that there's something to be done. So you are your own trigger, okay? When you're your own trigger, it's called initiative. And everybody loves it when you have initiative. So you want to tell a story where you were the trigger. Or even if someone else is a trigger, along the way, some things may have come to light, which you then caused things to move forward from. So then you make the last step of the beginning is you make a plan. So you have a context, you have trigger, and then you have a plan. The princess came running down from her tower and looked at the woodcutter's son in the eye and said, "Will you be my prince?" And he took one look at her and said, "Yes." And she said, "Great, let's go tell Dad we're in love so we can get married." In the work story, I called Tom and he and I planned how to minimize potential delays by pulling some of the team off their regular work and created a schedule to gather the information we could as quickly as possible. So now we know something about how they approach problems. How does the princess approach a problem? Well, she's a woman of action, right? And she may not think things through that well. But Allison in our work story obviously did take the time to think things through and made a plan. So then there's the middle of the story, and many people in the job market leave out the middle of the story. We had a terrible problem. We had a terrible problem with the budget. I fixed the budget and everything went ahead smoothly. No one cares, right? The princess is running down the stairs. Who cares? The princess got married. Nobody cares. Nobody's ever seen the movie where the princess got married after she met the woodcutter's son. Why? Because no one cares. You haven't told them the middle of the story. You haven't told them what happened. Everybody who hears your story, from the world's worst interviewer to the networker who is your best friend to anybody else, all know the story is going to come out well. And we all know that for every story we hear that comes out of Hollywood. And we'll talk about that in a minute or two. Why do we watch the movie? Why do we listen to the story? Because we want to know how it happened. And that's the middle of the story. That's the part that people leave out. They give a result, a great result. I increased sales by 3% a year for 2 years running. Good result. How did you do it? Why should I hire you as opposed to somebody else who might have 3% per year for 3 years?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is it important to set the stage or create the context at the very beginning as opposed to looping back around and saying, I did these things because?
Because until you answer that question, people are going to be holding the space in their mind for you to answer that question. That means that they're not listening to you with 100% of their attention. And you want them listening to you with 100% of their attention. Now, some Hollywood movies begin with like a building blowing up, right? And that's the way they begin the movie, but you're still distracted. They by the force of narrative and all the stuff going on the screen and the sound and all that, they're keeping you otherwise occupied, but you're still wondering what the hell is going on. You don't need to leave your audience with that question. You want to give them what they need when they need it.
Thanks.
So the princess's story does not end with they might end with, but you're leaving out a lot if you go skip directly from the woodcutter's son saying yes to they were married a month later and lived happily ever after. And the way that we tend to end the work story, after we solved a few problems, we closed 3 days early. It was a success. No one cares. So the most important thing after you make a plan is the action you take. But the next most important thing, and the thing which any good story should include, if at all possible, is what went wrong. Now, you're not going to tell stories where things went wrong and you got fired. You're not going to tell stories where what went wrong and it didn't work out. You're going to tell the stories where something went wrong and you made it work. That's the kind of story that we're telling here. There's no point telling a story in this context. I mean, this is pretty obvious, but I just want to say it out loud. There's no point telling a story where things didn't go wrong. If nothing went wrong in the job that you have, they would have hired somebody with 10 years less experience. The only reason that they hired you with your more experience is because you know how to deal better with things when they go wrong. So if you tell stories that illustrate how you handle things when things go wrong, then they'll have a reason to hire you.